This is Sovereign Independent Radio on UWS Community Radio and the International Community Radio Network. Breaking the truth.
Welcome to Sovereign Independent Radio. Tonight's guests are Alan Watts of Cutting Through the Matrix. We also have Brian Gerrish of the UK column. And later on, we're going to run a bit over time and have Tony Farrell, the ex-police intelligence analyst who recently came out and said the biggest threat of terrorism was coming from the British government. I'd like to welcome Alan Watts from Canada on the phone. You there, Alan?
I'm there, yep.
Hi. And Brian?
Yes, hi.
Yep. For those, it's quite surprising, Alan. We meet a lot of people in the so-called truth movement, and we mention your name, and it's quite surprising how few people actually know about you, and we try and point them in your direction because the information you put out is solid, and backed by documents and all the rest of it. And so for those out there who haven't heard you before, do you want to just explain how you started out on this journey, as it were, and what you do now?
Sure. Well, I should really say that I grew up in Scotland, and I knew from a very early age that things were just plain wrong. And I also realized too, we're in a regimented system, even in school, and everything's regimented from the government all the way down. And I kept wondering why we got this wonderful history of conquering different countries. And then I looked around me, and I thought, very few folk in this country really own their own homes. Everybody was scuffling for rent money. Even the economy was rigid. You found that the same starting wages for even tradesmen across the country were pretty well the same, minimum. Right from north to south, it was just the same way. And I realized you're in a fixed economy. This was designed this way. And the guys at the top that do all the statistics and so on knew darn well just how much it would take the average family to live and pay their rents and so on, and get to work and feed themselves and no more, basically. So it was a fixed economy. And I got into the history books, of course, to find out how the money system was run. And that's when the shocker came to find out literally that you're run by private banks, and government borrows from private banks with compound interest. And once you're into that cycle, from then to the present time, you can't get out of it. It's compound interest, and that keeps a small minority not only in control of the money, but the guys in control of the money are in control of the whole country. Today it's international. You've got a small group of people literally running the world and using NATO as their heavy, who go into countries, bomb them out of existence, and then the mates of the guys who are the major bankers, they end up getting all the freebies, the oil, the diamonds, the gold, and the mineral rights, just like they did in Yugoslavia. So it's astonishing. We're run really by a private gang who set up a long time ago to take over the world. This is documented. It sounds crazy, but you go into the writings of Cecil Rhodes, and he basically outlined the whole agenda. And then his group merged with the Lord Milner Society. Lord Alfred Milner was actually German, and he was a banker, international. And a bunch of international bankers formed, with the Cecil Rhodes Foundation, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Sounds awfully legitimate, sounds very governmental. It certainly has a royal charter to exist. But these guys followed on with the same tradition to use Britain as the embryo to take over the world. Already had an empire, and they wanted to carry on and get the whole world under this particular system. Not to help the people, by the way, but to hire mainly people from the best universities, mainly Oxford, old families, and to have to run it like a secret society. And Cecil Rhodes actually said this: we must copy the Jesuit techniques of secrecy, like a secret society, because the public shouldn't know what we're really on about, what our business is. And these guys fomented wars back in the late 1800s in their own writings, written. Well, actually, going to the historian for the group, Professor Carl Quigley, who had their archives there, he got the archives from Zimmerman, Zimmerman was a communist. He was the main communist of Britain. He had the he was the editor of the main communist papers. He was also assistant secretary to Winston Churchill. And then you start to see all these strange associations with people that you never expect to be associated with, like Zimmerman and Churchill, because Churchill, were told, hated communists. Well, why was his best advisor, his main advisor, a communist who wanted world empire too? And then quickly goes on to say, we work with communists, we work with fascists, we work with people across dictators. And he said, eventually we'll have to bring the United States into this, which they did in 1920s. They formed the Council on Foreign Relations. And that's just the same branch, the American branch of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. They're a private group. At the top, you have the top banking families. And they're taking over all resources. That's what Cecil Rhodes said. We have to take over all the resources and the wealth of the entire planet. And initially, they pretended to be benevolent dictators, in other words. They would share it properly. Properly. You understand what they mean by properly. That's like 90% to themselves. But they're one of the biggest organizations in the world today. Every country has a branch of the Council on Foreign Relations. Each British Empire country, the Commonwealth countries, have a branch in their own country running the show, all working inside politics and outside politics to bring in a world government. It's not a nice, pleasant thing. They try to portray it as peace and all the rest of it, but it's really a form of domination. In fact, it's the worst kind of domination you can imagine, because most people don't realize that war was declared on them 100 years ago, and the war encapsulates and takes from the Communist Manifesto of the abolition of private property, abolition of the family unit, the rearing and the moral giving to the children by the state. Pretty well all of the Communist Manifesto has been accomplished at the end of the nation state. Well, that's happened too with the EU. So you realize that before even Cecil Rhodes was on the go, this other organization obviously was at work on the same agenda before they became the Cecil Rhodes Foundation and before they became the Lord Alfred Milner Foundation. They said, as I say, that they need a bigger country with more resources, more manpower, and a bigger tax base to finish the job off. And that's when they brought the United States into it. The United States' only job is to be the taxpayer for the United Nations, the enforcer for the United Nations and NATO. And once that's done, there'll be nothing left in America. They'll be absolutely bankrupt. They already are. But they knew this back in the 1930s. When you read the Council on Foreign Relations memos from their meetings, their minutes of their meetings they had, annual meetings, they knew that America, towards the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, would be basically bankrupt, and it would maybe last another 20 years after it was declared officially bankrupt, before it went under. But by that time, they would have forced the rest of the world under the same world system, and that's where we are today. So it's an ongoing agenda. There are many facets to it. They have so many organizations under the United Nations umbrella. Most of them are private, non-governmental organizations, and they're backed by the parallel government. Maggie Thatcher called it the parallel government. When she retired, she said, now that I'm out in the limelight, she says, I belong to the parallel government. And this parallel government has more power than the elected government because we're not responsible to the people. She says we can get the big job done. And she says this organization is comprised of ex-prime ministers, presidents, and top bureaucrats who all already know each other, having been in office. And she said we can get things done faster. That ties in with the main think tank for the United Nations, which is the Club of Rome. And they wrote back in the 70s that democracy would not work. There were too many competing parties arguing for power, and therefore they'd have to go into a post-democratic society, which is authoritarian. And that is the job, of course, of the Maggie Thatcher, the Bill Clinton types, and so on, the parallel government. That's what they're doing now. They're actually on the trot all the time across the world, going to world meetings advocating unification of different parts. Now, the unification of Europe was first mentioned by Karl Marx. He said, we'll split the world into 3 regions. He said, first will be a European Union under a parliament, which in turn would be under a super parliament of the world. And that's the United Nations. He says eventually the United States and all of the Americas will come into an American region, and some of the Caribbean islands as well, which has happened. And they've been pushing for this and integrating steadily now for 15, 16 years. And then he said after that, he says we'll also have a Far East block as well, or region, with Australia, New Zealand, China, Japan, all put into the same block. And these would comprise the main 3 trading blocks of the world. And they could keep expanding, and that's why you see the EU expanding and expanding. They also have an African bloc. And these technically smaller blocks of larger countries like Africa will eventually be merged into the European Union as well. And there won't be the African bloc anymore. So this is the agenda. This is what we're living through today. It's a completely controlled society where science is supposedly going to rule us all from birth to death under an authoritarian system. And if they don't want you born, you will not be born. You must be born simply if there's a task they need you for. Many of the writers that belong to this society have published their memoirs, like Bertrand Russell, who worked with the Frankfurt Group, who gave you your culture, because that was the whole culture industry which he was involved in. And that's the music industry, that's the movies, television, everything. That's where we get our culture from. We copy them like monkeys, unfortunately, and we adapt to what we see. So we're going through a planned change. We have been for your whole life long. So are your parents. And you don't realize that the major wars we've gone through, even in the 20th century, were fomented and set up and designed from London by the Royal Institute of International Affairs, because Quigley goes into that. And he said, even when they were fighting the Boers to take over South Africa, because Cecil Rhodes Foundation, Milner, all the bankers wanted the diamonds and the gold, they'd been pressing already for 14 years with a war with Germany, which they wanted to make into a global war. And the hope of that was to bring out a United Nations or a League of Nations, which they did. That's what they did at the end of World War I. And they hoped by that time they would be so war-weary that every country would be persuaded to give up its sovereignty and join the blocs. And they tried that, but nobody went for it. The public didn't want it. They liked their cultures. They liked their traditions. And so they went on the back burner for a while, and other members of the same group, like H.G. Wells, who was a propagandist for them, said in one of his own writings, we need another war. They're not ready yet. We need another war to bring them to their knees. And that's why they brought World War II along. We know from Professor Anthony Sutton and others who've gone into who financed Hitler and Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, it's the same conglomeration of bankers and these top politicians belonging to the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which have been behind all the major changes throughout the 20th century and the present century. But what's amazing too is the wars we've had even, in the late 90s, as I say with Yugoslavia, the World Bank, which is part of the group, because eventually the World Bank has to get risen up to its top power, and along with the Bank for International Settlements. And that was also documented by Professor Quigley, who was a historian for this group. And the IMF, again, you can drop their top power. The World Bank, back in the early 90s, published what they wanted to get out of, say, Yugoslavia, Bosnia. And they had all the mines put down, all manufacturing put down, and they used NATO as a private army to go in there. And they bombed, just like they did with Iraq, they bombed all their infrastructure, all their food-making supplies, everything, water supplies, everything. And then, of course, the people were decimated. They came in under the United Nations, and they brought NATO in under Madeleine Albright, and then they divvied up the country to the private bankers for the debt that Yugoslavia now incurred. And every part or small country that used to belong to Yugoslavia owes billions and billions and billions of never-ending debt to the IMF. So using economic power, which is a part of warfare, economics is the most important part of warfare, in fact. You bring every country under your thumb, technically your ownership. And the countries that are on the sidelines of war, like Canada, we're still part of it because we're borrowing from the same private banks. And we're highly indebted to them with compound interest, which is designed so that you can never get out of it. So that's basically what we're living through today. The end of sovereignty, the destruction of all cultures that previously existed. Tony Blair's right-hand man came out and said that in the British major media. He said that he was told to open the floodgates to the whole of the UK in order to destroy forever the last vestige of British culture so that it can never reappear in any form whatsoever. And that was mainstream, and nobody commented on it. Quite surprising.
Hi, it's interesting what you say about Yugoslavia, because I've driven through Serbia and Croatia on a number of occasions, and you see the infrastructure that's been built there since the war, obviously on borrowed money. I mean, the motorways and all the new housing that's been built, all the rest of it. I mean, it's all, high-tech, modern. I mean, they have better roads there than they have in Britain. And
the problem over there too is that they're not even allowed to have their own central bank, a private bank of their own. They're not even allowed that. They pay rent for everything, and it's all foreigners who own their land that they sit on, that the houses are built on, or they pay rent to. All the companies that are left are foreign owned, because they put you up on the auction block, and of course they already have their pre-designed buyers, selected buyers, because there's no such thing as free competition in this system. And as I say, the World Bank even put that out before they started bombing those countries in the first place. They knew the value of each mine, they knew the value of the land, they knew what they wanted to build after they blew down millions of homes. And who would own them. They published their findings before it all happened.
Yeah, well, I mean, all the petrol stations in Serbia are all Russian owned. So they don't seem to own anything. But going back to the UK and Ireland, I suppose we'll start there. You commented a while ago on your own broadcast that Ireland was going to be taken down completely. And somebody's commented here that you maybe suggested that that idea had been changed. But what's your feelings on what's going to happen to Ireland in the future?
Well, Ireland definitely has to be taken down, because this is a very old organisation we're talking about, and their plan is very old. They say in the 1800s, especially, lots was published on this. But you find the top economists that are still quoted today from that period, like John Stuart Mill, and then his son of the same name, they both said that certain cultures would never fit in with a new order of things, because they're so they don't like giving up rights and freedoms. And they had the Scots listed as one, they had the Irish as a second one, they had the American Indian down because he would not adapt into an economic system where you work from 8 to 5 for a paycheck. And another one too was the blacks in Africa. This is, well, those who can mimic, these are the words they used, those who can mimic the white man and copy his structure will be allowed to come through into the new system. The rest of them, they said, cannot come through, or they'll destroy the new system. So this is again Darwinian as well. Darwin said a similar thing. He said those inferior types will bring down the superior types if we bring in a new system. So we're all basically being slated for either breeding out of existence, which is an old Norman trick, by the way, if you go into your history books, or simply lots of folk will die off without getting married at all, because there's a destruction of marriage. Folk can get lots of sex, but they're having no children. And so that was the other way too. H.G. Wells also wrote a book called A Modern Utopia, where he projected the system they would bring in after they had sterilized all the inferior types. He says, we weren't so bad as to kill them all at once. He says, we just sterilized them so eventually they died out. And when we talk about these things, it sounds crazy to the folk who listen to the mainstream. You've got to understand that the mainstream is owned by this group. Your whole reality, in fact, your whole life long, is owned by this group. In fact, this group even publishes all your history books in every country for educational purposes, right up through university. And even Winston Churchill brought that topic up when he found out during World War II that this group had been highly manipulative in bringing about World War II. He brought it up in the House of Commons because he wasn't in the loop on that particular level at that time. And he said it's astonishing to know that a small group of people based here, he says in London, have been manufacturing the British history at that time, middle of the war, manufacturing that from at least the late 1800s, and giving us false history as to the reasons why things happen, and teaching our children from all schools right up through university, basically a false history of what actions have happened in history, why they happened, and so on. And so he was really furious at it. He said they were so secretive in his time that they didn't even use the name that it went under, which was the Royal Institute for International Affairs. That's the later name they adopted. Before that it was called the Milner Group. The junior workers that were put into politics and bureaucracy was simply called the Kindergarten, and that's in the book Tragedy and Hope, and the Anglo-American Establishment by Professor Carroll Quigley, who again was the historian for this group. Yeah.
Alan, I wonder if I could just ask you a question on. We talked a little bit about Ireland there. How do you see the UK at the moment? What do you think's unfolding here?
Well, the UK has to go into a very primitive lifestyle. When they're talking austerity, they're talking about poverty for most people. What I should add to this too, as Professor Quigley said, the system they're bringing in is a new feudal system. And I think we all know what feudalism is. Where your betters, the better types, the ones who come out of special wombs basically, will be the ones who will guide you from birth to death. Right through the system, if they need you, that is. And Quigley also said that the CEOs of major international corporations will be the new feudal overlords. Well, we see chunks of land being sold off under the guise of business and commerce in Britain and elsewhere to major international corporations. And eventually, like Karl Marx said, the nation state will wither away. He didn't add why he knew and how he knew it would wither away. Well, we're going to find out because they're selling off big chunks of what was sovereign territory to foreign, that you can't even call them, they're not people, they're not nations, they're entities, they're fictional entities called international corporations. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you've got to understand too that you've had a war on your culture that was tried and failed, especially in Britain, in the 1920s. The 1920s was called the Roaring Twenties. They tried prohibition. They had their own versions in Britain, where you had to go to the next town to get a drink if you wanted to. So that was intended to make the booze cans, the legal places, very exciting to youngsters, which it did. And they brought the miniskirt in at the time. They gave them the Charleston, and they told them to go at it, free sex, free love. And something that, by the way, H.G. Wells was told to write about and promote from the late 1800s, believe it or not, in his books. And so they brought it in the 1920s, but the fallout was too much. The venereal disease went rampant. There was no penicillin. Unwanted pregnancies everywhere. That's when they opened up the massive orphanages across the U.S. and Britain and elsewhere, the Boys Town type places. And so they couldn't cope with the fallout. So they went back to the drawing board. And in the 1960s, they brought it back more perfected. They gave them the pill at the same time. We had antibiotics for some of the venereal diseases. We We were given abortions, free abortions, to take care of any problems. The state will take care of any problems for you. Then the destruction of the family unit was all part of that. It was very, very successful. Decimated the population of Britain. And even in the official reports, as they shout about overpopulation, you'll see that Britain's been plummeting from their official census, even at the United Nations, since about the 1950s onwards. We've been plummeting until the reason they give now for mass immigration, although it's not really for that, it's for two or three purposes. The reason they give is we need the population, younger people to come in, and because none of the older ones have had any children. Well, they weren't having children because they were told to have free love and not to have children for years and years and years, male and female. Just have fun, play like children till you're 80 and die, And that's what they were doing. So now this is the excuse for massive population, but really is part of the total, as I say, the end of all culture that will happen as all these people move in and take over, and you're in the minority. As I say, they said they've got to destroy these cultures forever. And that was the assistant to Tony Blair who said that.
Yeah. Do you think we can do something about it?
I'll tell you, we're so late on this that it would take something really extraordinary and powerful to change this. We've got to understand, you've never had democracy. Democracy is a front, in fact, for this very group. It never ends up being what you think it is. Democracy, in reality, that we see is totalitarianism by bureaucracy. That's what it is. And international corporations hand in glove with them. The saddest thing is that Bertrand Russell, who also worked for the same group, who was given lots of money by a royal charter, by the way, to do things that you would string up adults today for doing, he had a special school set up to find ways of promoting pre-pubertal sex in children in the 1920s, by encouraging them to have that at school, and all kinds of sex as well. And he says the idea was to if they can have promiscuity before puberty comes in, and we hyperactivate them to think about sex all the time by constant repetition. He said that these children will never bond with a partner for their whole lives and probably never have a child. That was their goal. But what we're looking at today is the end product, the disaster of it all. It worked so well. And what you need now is more than just talking. What I do know, when I look at the reality of the wars that are ongoing across the Middle East, for instance, that was ongoing but when Clinton was in, and then Bush was in, and then the present one is in. It doesn't matter the front man. It's the same agenda with the same list of countries that must be taken out. And then the big banking boys move in and take over all the resources. We're seeing one after another our whole lives long go under in this fashion. These guys are not going to give up. They're using, as I say, NATO like a private army for thievery and robbery, and depopulation big time of their enemies. They're not going to give up because you ask them. They won't do it. It's not going to happen. I've watched an internal army built up of so-called policemen in some countries that are not like the policemen I used to know. You don't walk up to the present policeman and ask him for the time. He might shoot you, So they built up internal armies over the last 25, 30 years in preparation for what's to come, because we're dealing with long-term planning here. Just like businesses too, especially international businesses, they do their long-term investments, takeovers and all. They got all planned for the next 50, 75 years. Well, these guys are the same boys who plan our futures. And they will not just walk away because we tell them that they're not nice people and this is not democratic. It's not going to happen. They know they're going to bring down the final crashes. That's to get us to our knees. They've told us they're going to bring in food rationing across the world. You've got to go into the United Nations. There's a front group for the main group that's based in London. That's what all the United Nations is. And go into their different departments. Look into the Department for Agriculture, Food and Agriculture. was a woman at the time who was the CEO of that department. She said that food was too important to be left to farmers, and that corporate farming only, large, massive corporate farming, was the only way they were going to go. And she says the day will come when we will be responsible, the United Nations, for distributing the world's food supply to each region across the planet. She says this will have the added influence on population control, she says, because we shall not up the quotas. In fact, we'll bring the quotas down. And it's up to each region then to find ways to bring their population down. That's their problem. And it's funny that, because only last week I got a mainstream media, they said again, the same thing was said again. The United Nations must eventually take control of the whole world's food supply and ration it out equally amongst the people across the world, just like we're now into the Communist Manifesto part of the redistribution of wealth. Why would they mandate the redistribution of wealth when you've never been taxed so much in your life? You've been through bank crashes, national bank failures, and now they go ahead to redistribute your wealth, your tax money across the world. It doesn't go to the poor countries. It goes to the big corporations, international boys who set up bases in those countries. But regardless, if you're stone broke, why would they start? Well, you see, they must fulfill this agenda. It's a plan. It's a holy plan, by the way. I think folks should understand this. This isn't just a little club here of very rich people that just have a penchant for power. This is a religion here that's behind this. And you'll notice that everything is coming through law. Law after law after law. No matter how crazy the law seems, it's all done by law. So you're into a very old society that does long-term planning, that admits in its own writings that it's used communism, capitalism, socialism, dictators, tyrants even, and they don't care who they mix with and use, to get their own long-term mission accomplished. So they're not going to back off, and it's going to take an awful lot of struggle. I know in the US, just a few days ago there, some major media were picking up on Brzezinski's statements that there's going to be mass riots in Britain, in the US. So the US is the same way. 2001 had nothing to do with terrorists, because every government across the planet went into action with the same agenda at the same time. That never even happened when Pearl Harbor happened in World War II. So you got to understand, this took years and years of planning beforehand, with treaties and counter-treaties, and they go back for review and back. It takes many years to get all countries on board with the same agenda, the exact same agenda of total surveillance on every citizen from birth to death. And every country jumped into the same action plan at the same time with the same treaties. That took years of planning. In the US, in academia, the so-called left-wing liberal guys, the professors, were pushing for the century of change, for the latter part of the 20th century, talking about the millennium. And they said the millennium would kick off this century of change. And by that they meant total liberalism. And you got to understand what they mean in the US by liberalism is not what most folk think of. It's not splashing more ketchup on your French fries, you know. And they said that it would take a Pearl Harbor event to kick this off, and that was from the New American Century group that were backing Bush at the time. It doesn't matter who the front men are; it's the same people behind it each time, with each president.
Alan, I agree with all the points that you've run through, and I'm just thinking for listeners out there, one of the major difficulties is not that there's no evidence. There's just so much evidence that it's difficult to package it sometimes, so that people can start to grasp it, because it is a big thing. It's a very big thing. But out there is a huge amount of evidence, which you know off by heart. But for other people, we can say that the moment you start looking, there's many other people who many years before us have been digging into this, and they've been writing and warning about what's happening. I've got a couple of books in front of me. I've got a soft spot for a guy called Commander Carr, who was
Guy Carr,
a Canadian.
Yeah.
And he wrote a book called Pawns in the Game. And if you go through his book, it covers everything that you've touched on. And of course, he was touring in Canada in the 1930s, trying to warn people of what was building. I've got one of Christopher Story's books here. I've got Behind Communism by Frank L. Britton, which is a very good book. You can get that from Bloomfield Books. And that, of course, is delving into an area that people don't often look at, and many people don't like to go because it's quite dark. But it's saying, well, where did the communists come from? And what it's starting to point out, of course, is that it was the same banking cabals that created the fascist problem. So we know there's a lot of evidence out there. But I think at the moment that we've got something absolutely unique, and the other side has given it to us, and that's the internet. And I look out the window at the moment, and on one hand I can see the beast that you're talking about is clamping down very quickly, but it's doing that in a more and more obvious way. And the other thing that's happening is that I believe the other side is starting to rush. And the reason it's rushing is because it knows that more and more people are starting to see the plan for what it really is. And of course the internet and modern media, whether it's a phone or the mobile phone, means that the message can go worldwide very quickly. And if you say what are these people frightened about or frightened of, I agree totally when you say you can't just ask them to go away. But something that they are completely terrified of is just exposure, is enough people being able to see what they're doing. And if I focus just in on the UK at the moment, it's fascinating to watch how a chubby cabbage patch, as we know him, Prime Minister Cameron, has gone from that unwrinkled, smooth-faced schoolboy to looking incredibly haggard and nervous and upset in the space of 3 days or, well, a week's media exposure. So I think that we're here on the show and we're helping people to see what's going on. But I've got to say, I'm actually getting very, very interested in the effect that we, and I mean that's a very big we, not just yourself, but all of the people who've been out there speaking and talking about what's happening, and other people who are passing messages on email and Twitter and the internet, the message is coming out about what these people are doing. And
it's coming out.
Also,
it's coming out. Yeah.
Sorry?
Here's what we've got to watch for, though. And I realized this an awful long time ago, is that the world is planned by military strategy. And these guys at the top have had a long time, a lot of practice in this stuff, down through centuries, actually. And they know what they want to do in stages, and they plan it, each part, what year it's going to happen, this is going to happen, that part's going to happen. But they also know, and they're trained to do this by other ways, which I won't go into, but they know what the reactions will be in different segments of the population. And so they try and plan ahead to even give us heroes. And here's the thing people have to be very careful of. They try to give us heroes at times before they even start the operation that would create the need for a hero. And so they'll have someone in the wings ready to take over. Some of them talking to crazy stuff, and that way it puts so many people off. So be careful, again, don't just go all over outer space when you hear this stuff. But the other part is too, remember, they gave us the internet, and they knew what its effects were going to be. In fact, before they gave us the internet, in the newspapers, they were talking about the coming information wars before they gave us the darn thing. So they were already prepared for that too. We've got to remember too, it gives them an instant pulse on the public on a daily basis across the world. They know what we're chatting about. They try and guide us, of course, into the wrong places now, but they know what we're chatting about. They know the mood of the people, and they know the danger, if there's a danger from the people as well. They are at a crucial point, no doubt about it, because they must pull this off, and mainly because, as I say, they have a timetable. And they must stick to the timetable. They're really obsessional about timetables. And but they're also ready, as I say, to take care of the worst things of all, and that's mass rioting. If mass rioting comes in, remember, a riot really, and they keep saying this in their own writings, they call it the mob effect. A rioter is not going by any plan. It's someone who's basically screaming, yelling, and setting fire to his own cars in his own street. And that happens when your back's against a wall and you are on food rationing and you are broke. What you have to have is organization. What we're up against here is a network across the world of very old families who are masters. They're trained from childhood in this organization. These are the most organized people on the planet. In fact, we're living in their system. This is not our system. And when you realize this is not our system, even how the culture has changed, it's not even our culture. TV gave us the culture. Music television gave us the culture. And their scientists gave us the rest of it. So we've got to realize that you got to have a basis to start from. And you've got to have your own manifesto. They have theirs. You got to have your own manifesto to start from too. And you need to have numbers in the groups to stand up together, or they'll pick you off one at a time, which they're actually doing. And you got to know where you're heading. That's the main thing. For all the talk radio hosts out there, no one is coming out with what to do. You see?
Oh, I disagree. I disagree, because this word exposure is absolutely key. The plan that they've put together, and I agree that we're looking at a network across the world. We're looking at some very powerful families, and we know that they train and plan and they do all those sorts of things. But the plan across the centuries has been hidden. It's been specifically designed to be hidden in the shadows or completely buried so that ordinary people couldn't understand what was happening to them.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
It's a covert plan. It was a covert plan. And if you translate it across to military terminology, just to go in that direction, because it's a bit of fun for me, is that if you unleash a covert plan, and you might be doing quite well, but the moment the other side sees what you're doing, there's absolutely no point in being covert. You have to become overt, and then you have to do everything much faster because you're discovered. And every time there is a major hit at the moment on an individual or an organization where people really know what they're doing, you see the other side absolutely shudder, because it's only to expose them that actually wins the battle. Because when enough people...
And I think once you're on, the thing about exposing them, you've got to keep at it, and even the same ones too. And you believe part of the problem is we've got so many to choose from.
well, the other bit I was going to add is that I personally don't think we need a manifesto, because it's simpler than that. The other side is working in the shadows, or has been, and it lies. It consistently lies in who it is, what it's doing, the world we live in. The whole ethos of the other side is lies. And our counter to that is not a manifesto, it's a single word, it's truth. Because if we publish the truth, if we get people looking at the truth and seeking the truth, you completely destroy what the other side is doing. And the other magic for this, I don't like that word too much, but I've said it now, is that as you push forward the truth, you've never got to double check yourself, because you know what you're saying is true, what the message is, and that is what brings the numbers on board. There's that old saying that a minority that's right soon becomes the majority. And I actually think that these families are very, very frightened at the moment, because the change to only a few people knowing, from only a few people knowing to millions of people knowing what's going on could happen overnight. It could certainly happen in the space of a few days. And once that message has gone worldwide, these people are finished, because ordinary people just say no. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which area you look into. If you go into the military or the police that you're talking about, inside the police force, they are not. Even though we might not be too impressed by the British police at the moment, but it's totally wrong to say that the other side are in the majority. They're in the minority. So if you look for a solution inside the police or inside the military or inside politics or inside your local authority, all it takes is for the majority of good people to understand what's actually being done to them. And then the whole thing is destabilized. It can't work. And I know it's a massive battle going on, but I think the key point about UK is the seat of the power is in this country. Well, that's what I believe. I don't know whether you'd agree with that. And therefore, if that is true, if we do the right things in Britain, the rest of it is going to unfold across the world. And I think that's started to happen.
Mm-hmm. Here's the thing too. Remember, they will still try and distract whatever you do. Quickly too, by giving you another bank crash or something like that, or food rationing. That will come if they get their way. We've got to stop it all before it happens. This is the key. We can't get to the stage where backs are against the wall and these big corporations, these big agri farm businesses have the world's food supply. I mean, they own most of it already, and they can ransom us at any time. Blackmail is a great thing for them when you're on your knees. They can't go off in riots either, because there's not, again, no coordination to it. There's no purpose to it, and it's easily vanquished. But exposure is one thing, but it's getting harder in some countries to expose them, actually, by laws. Yeah.
That's true. So I've just come back to the business that if we're in the business of fighting these people, well, you're the other side of the water, but for us here, it seems the UK is the place the battle is going to happen, because this is actually the seat of the power.
Yeah, and you're further ahead with all the experimentation on society that they've done than we all copy what Britain does afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's true. But the other bit that I'm going to say, I think, has been a major brick out of the wall, it's going to cause a real problem for these people, is to do with the behavioural control. I'm absolutely sure that at this stage, they thought they would be doing all of the meat of the plans you've talked about there with the food and the banking and riots and everything else. And while all that was going on, people would be totally unaware that actually they were acting out of character, that their behaviour had been changed. And this was again a key part of a covert plan, that people would have their behaviour interfered with and modified. They wouldn't know it. And that is exactly what the government has been saying in its behavioural change documentation, that either people would realise they'd been changed but didn't know how it had happened, or they wouldn't even realise their behaviour had been changed.
Yeah.
Now, I think this was a significant part of the package, and it's been upset because not only are people realising exactly how their behaviour has been changed and how it's being done, that this knowledge, the wakening up of this on this is spreading very quickly.
Well, but we've got to, as I say, push. It's a matter of constant attack, and again, not being distracted as they give you something to be, because again, they're masters at distracting us. Again, with very real things, the economy, the inflation. They can whack us with so many things at one time to throw us off when we're pushing hard. But you've got to stay on the track and keep pushing and keep exposing all through that hard period, you know. Hello?
Hi. Sorry, my mic was off there. I was going to say when Brian was talking about the exposure, I think in terms of the likes of Cameron, Clegg, or Enda Kenny and Ireland, I think they're only scratching the surface of exposing these people, and they'll obviously be just sacrificed, and they'll bring somebody else in who's looking squeaky clean again to give people some kind of semblance of normality again. But I kind of agree with Brian. I think people are starting to see through that as well. Each change of leader just brings more of the same. And I think that exposure of people so quickly in their term of office, if you will, it's starting to happen more rapidly from the public point of view. And the longer that continues, because the quicker people realise that the whole political system, it doesn't matter who gets in, they're all following the same agenda, and it's becoming more and more obvious as they show themselves to be following the same agenda far quicker than you would normally have seen maybe 20 years ago, where they kind of did it slowly. But now they're actually coming in, and it's rapid. It's and it's continual. There's no let up in it. So people are kind of taking the punches one after the other and realising there's something far wrong.
Hello? Yeah, that was awful muffled my end. I don't know if Brian got it. Or...
You hear it, Brian?
Yeah, you were loud and clear to me. I'm still having a job with Alan, though. He's very quiet.
It's still quiet, eh? Yeah.
Did you hear what I was saying? Anyway. Maybe we'll go to a music break and try and get the connection back again.
What I can do, I can try a different phone here and see if it helps, eh?
Okay. We'll go to a piece of music and then we'll come back and try that. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.